Okay. Thank you so much, Albrecht, for a wonderful introduction and for the welcome to the conference. And thank you, Ulrich and Annette, for the welcome to the conference as well. Thank you for the invitation to talk to you. It's wonderful to be involved in a conference on accounting, although I think there's a lot of different disciplines here, so I don't feel so. So I'm actually speaking to you now. Let's see. Can I move my... Yes, I'm speaking to you from Sydney, from the unceded territory of the Darug, Darawal and Gadigal people of the Aurora Nation, here on the banks of the Georges River, which was what the settlers called this river, where that red dot is. Only one of the tributaries of the river still has its Aboriginal name, which is the Mill Creek. So as we do in Australia now, thankfully, I'd like to acknowledge this country, and it always was and always will be Aboriginal land, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And this is especially important this week in Australia because it's what's called Nadoc Week, which is a week set aside every July to celebrate the history, culture and achievements of Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islanders. It's celebrated not just by Indigenous communities, but also by Australians from all walks of life. So the title of my talk, What is the Role of Accounting in Making Other Worlds Possible, is a very potent question, I think, to be asking this week, Nadoc Week in Australia. It's often said that accounting is the language of business, and to quote a kind of mainstream definition, accounting is about recording and classifying and summarizing in terms of money, transactions and events which are of a financial character, the results thereof. I'm sure you're kind of familiar with that kind of standard definition. Well, for Australian Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, colonial dispossession, and including the ongoing removal of children from Indigenous families, is often referred to as sorry business. So this acknowledgement of country is just one small step, I think, in accounting for sorry business. It's a form of recording and classifying, and it registers the violent events and transactions that have never adequately been accounted for, really, certainly not financially, in this country. So what might a full accounting of sorry business actually involve? And I think we'd probably need ways of measuring intergenerational privilege that was gained by dispossession and the intergenerational costs of genocide if we were to fully account for sorry business. And just to return then to my acknowledgement, I'd like to note that I have inherited a lot of privilege based on the dispossession and exploitation of Indigenous Australians and Pacific Islanders in this country over the past 200 years. Can I really account for it? Probably not, but I'd like to at least record it here. Just on one side of my family, I'm a fourth generation Australian, descended from a poor English butcher's apprentice who was convicted for stealing and transported to Australia as a convict in the early 19th century. And he worked in servitude for a very wealthy doctor who had appropriated land on the banks of the Nepean River over in Western Sydney, and who built a mansion called Regentville. When this relative of mine was freed, he set himself up as a butcher in Penrith, which was out in Western, and his son became a grain holder, a merchant, and his son, my grandfather, became a clergyman. So within one generation, my family moved from poverty to the middle class on one side. And on the other side, I'm a third generation Australian descended from free Scottish settlers who came, a father and his sons came and established the Bingara sugar plantation, which is in the picture up in the top right-hand corner. It was established on stolen Aboriginal land in Queensland, which is Australia's kind of deep south. And here the Gibsons employed stolen and enslaved Pacific Island labourers, who you can see in this picture, on the sugar plantation. My grandfather, who was the son of this Scottish slave owner, moved to Sydney to become a doctor, bought, again, stolen land in Gunnamatta Bay, where I spent much of my childhood playing in what I thought was called Daruk Park, but was really named after the surviving Darug people who gave that park its name. And it's really only in latter years that I have come to know this history and to start thinking about what is my responsibility here. So this week I said we're asked to celebrate the history and culture of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, but to move towards making other worlds possible, we really need to do a much fuller accounting of the sorry business that our contemporary society is built on. And I guess this is just one small example of the challenge that we face in thinking about making other worlds possible. And I can't go much further on this particular line of argument at the moment, but I do think it highlights the importance of the topic under examination at this conference. And particularly it brings to light the skills that we will bring to the notion of accounting for other worlds from our kind of interdisciplinary perspectives. So as I'm sure you all recognize, accounting is an art, it's a practice, and to some extent, it plays a pretty major role in what's called making worlds. As Bruno Latour has reminded us, social scientists have long been involved in taking into account aspects of the social world and putting them into order. So he wrote in Reassembling the Social that all the disciplines, from geography to anthropology, from accounting to political science, from linguistics to economics, all of these disciplines are involved in extending the range of entities at work in the world and actively participating in transforming some of them into faithful and stable intermediaries. And he goes on to write, thus economists, for instance, are not simply describing some economic infrastructure which has always been there from the beginning of time. They're revealing calculative abilities in actors who didn't know before that they had them, and making sure that some of these new competencies are sunk into common sense through the many practical tools of bank accounts, rights, cash register slips, and other plugins. So Latour is pointing to this way in which disciplines make worlds. And I think accounting techniques are one of the very key ways in which a certain kind of world and a certain kind of economic rationality is made common sense. But can accounting then make other worlds? This is the question. And what is the role of accounting in economic and social transformation? So what I wanted to do in this talk then is reflect on two of my attempts to do a form of alternative accounting, that is to try and intervene into and reshape economic common sense. Both attempts were attempts to account for value, and both were and are motivated by an intention of making other worlds possible. And the first of them is something that, an experiment that I was involved in very early on in my career, in the late 70s and 1980s. And it was a project that was involved in accounting for social labor using Marxian value categories. Some of you might have a sense of deja vu, or maybe it casts you back many, many decades to think about the excitement that was around at the time around these kinds of questions. And I guess I should just offer a spoiler alert. I judge this attempt that I was very involved in to have been a dismal failure. But it did provide, I think, an impetus for me for much of the more generative subsequent work that I did, that Julie and I did. But actually, Julie and I were involved in this together. We worked with an econometrician, Don Schakow, and another geographer, Ron Horvath. And the context, as I said, was the late 1970s and early 1980s, in the kind of heyday when Marxian political economy was kind of revolutionizing many of the social sciences. And many of us were involved in, as we saw it, understanding the world in order to change it, and some of us thought we had a better way of doing that than others. So in the late 1970s, 1980s, there was a lot of attention to the internationalization of capital and the emergence of global corporations that were reshaping the nature of production internationally, and were having a huge impact on old industrial centers, such as in the New England region of the US, where I was studying for my PhD. So there was a lot of interest in the transformations that were taking place in capitalist economies, and I was involved in a research group that were theorizing this in terms of what we call variants of capitalism. And we weren't thinking about stages, as many Marxists had talked about: competitive stage, monopoly stage, global stage of capitalism. We were trying to look at the way in which there was an unevenness to the restructuring of capitalist economies. I guess that partly came from being geographers, very much involved in place and thinking through why it was that the paper manufacturers of in the New England part of the US were closing down. The textiles had already moved to the south. Some things were still there and were flourishing, but other production sites had been removed overseas or to other parts of the US. So our theory of variance was a kind of giving us a new way of starting to look at the ways in which economic restructuring and sectoral crisis took place in complex capitalist economies. And of course, as radical geographers, influenced by the work of David Harvey and others, we were reading Marx, and we were trying to pierce the sort of veil of bourgeois economics. We were very interested in the way in which we could think about rates of exploitation as being involved in this restructuring, forms of raising organic compositions of capital, the way in which the ratio between technology and living labor was changing. And we were also very interested in Marx's theory of rate of profit as an instigator of crisis. So we got involved in a rather large empirical project of trying to go behind the so-called price sphere, where the market establishes equivalence between the commodities and the monies that are exchanged for those commodities, to delve into the underlying sphere of value, or where social labor resided. So for us, social labor was something that was scientifically observable, but it was hidden behind the kind of Marxian accounting procedures by which most economies were documented. So to conduct this research, we got involved in a social accounting of flows of value within the US economy, looking at it from a perspective of industrial sectors. And here we got involved in a large empirical project of transforming price data collected in Keynesian categories and trying to calculate value categories. So we had to learn matrix algebra, we had to manipulate input-output data sets into industry transactions tables. We had to look at the conformity of data over time, and in this case, this paper looked at data from 1958 to 1982. And we were trying to look at the ways in which the changes that were happening in different sectors, this movement, these structural changes from either competitive to monopoly capital or from monopoly to global, was taking place in certain sectors and not in others, and how it related to rates of surplus value extraction, the organic composition of capital, profit. This might seem like a rather arcane kind of project, but it was extremely involving and very exciting at the time. Of course, we were interested in how these rates of profit would bear upon these kind of structural dynamics and structural changes in these manufacturing firms. And we collected a lot of information about the rates of unionization, the kinds of changes that were happening in the more qualitative aspects of these sectors, as well as this value data. So the question was, how was this supposed to lead to other worlds? And in the case of, in those days, of course, we were more interested in thinking about revolution, or at least restructuring to a post-capitalist world. Well, we were still very much traditional Marxists. We were interested in crisis in relation to falling rates of profit. and the crisis response to falling rates of profit was capitalist restructuring. But increasingly, I think, certainly Julie and I came to see ourselves in this kind of do loop of theorizing crisis and capitalist restructuring, and using this technique of trying to unveil the master's tools in the price sphere to try and understand what was happening in the value sphere, produce this basically the same account of the same object, capitalist industry dynamics. We were just dotting the T's and dotting the I's and crossing the T's and trying to establish a more sophisticated understanding of capitalist restructuring, which ultimately I thought, and we found, wasn't telling us any more than what people in the workplace knew or observing as they tried to deal with things like the restructuring of the world car industry to gain a little bit of the car industry for Australia or for the US or whatever. So increasingly we became disenchanted, I suppose, with this kind of approach. We felt it wasn't helping us smash capitalism or thinking about a different kind of world. And so we started to get involved in another way of thinking about what we were doing and wrote a paper called Waiting for the Revolution. We'd got sick of waiting for it, or How to Smash Capitalism While Working at Home in Your Spare Time. And this sort of saw the end of our engagement with this alternative accounting exercise. And I think from the perspective of today, I look back on this period and with some amazement, but also with some sense of gratitude for the training it gave me, and also, I guess, the training it gave me in seeing that accounting is itself a performative practice. It is a political practice, and it's a practice in which what's included and not included are very important questions that need to be ethically debated. So moving on from that period of our lives, Julie and I rethought and as Albrecht mentioned, we wrote a book in 1996 called The End of Capitalism as We Knew It, and that picture of Sisyphus that I showed was on the cover of the Blackwell's version of this book. Sisyphus was rolling his stone up the hill only to have it roll back down on him perpetually, and we felt that radical political economy was doing the same thing. It was increasingly theorizing more sophisticated forms of capitalism with the attempt to try and think beyond capitalism, but we were losing. We didn't have any language for doing that. So this was our critique of strong theory that Albrecht has mentioned. And the translation of our book done in the early 2000s, where I feel like it kind of captured the spirit of what we were trying to do with our book, The End of Capitalism, was to throw our kind of little stones as being the little Davids trying to screw up the works of the big Goliath capitalism that's churning up people and churning up the world. So our argument was that the discourse that we had created as radical political theorists and political economists was standing in the way of thinking otherwise and start now, right now, here and now, with what we have, to think about different kinds of economies, and particularly more ethical economies. And of course, one of the big influences on our rethinking was what feminists were thinking, particularly Marilyn Waring, who had written her book If Women Counted, which was a huge critique of the ways in which women's work, unpaid work, was not part of any sort of national account. It was not part of a sense of what was economically useful or important when thinking about national economies. But building on her work, we were also interested in all the different kinds of sites of economic activity that were producing goods and services and values and care that were excluded from a mainstream economic vision. And it was from the basis of this kind of I suppose, inventory of all the things that were excluded from mainstream economics that we started to conceptualize. So this image of the iceberg was very important in our work, particularly in our work with communities where there was deindustrialization taking place, or rural communities in Asia where they never were seeing part of the kind of trickle down that was supposed to be happening with development. This image was showing how people are involved in all sorts of economic practices, but they're not seen as the sort of recognized economy. And if we think back to the work we were doing in the value accounting work, we weren't even including all wage labor. We were only including what was defined as productive labor. So, you know, the kind of purity of that vision was based on exclusions of so much of what people were doing, what work was, and what was keeping lives afloat. So our work on diverse economies then was to do a different kind of inventory. I don't know whether you'd call it an accounting, but an inventory of all the different kinds of labor, kinds of transactions, kinds of enterprise, kinds of property relations and financial and forms of finance that coexist in our so-called capitalist economy. But we really wanted to start to think about us living in a more than capitalist economy or diverse economies. And this work has really, I guess, sustained me since the mid-90s when Julie and I wrote Take Back the End of Capitalism. It was followed 10 years later by Post-Capitalist Politics, which was reflecting more on our action research. And then more recently, Take Back the Economy, which I'll come to in a minute. But interestingly, I guess, and again, it's quite gratifying to see that we were invited just recently to produce a handbook of diversity. It kind of signifies the fact that this field has become a kind of subfield, and we were able to produce, with Kelly Dombrowski as co-editor, a book with 58 chapters and 66 authors from our research network, the Community Economies Research Network. So this volume was published in 2020, and unfortunately, given COVID, we haven't been able to do as much launching as we would have liked. But this then leads me back to a different kind of accounting that we became involved in, and we tried to popularize in a book that was written, conceptualized before Julie died in 2010, but finally saw the light of day in 2013, and it was co-authored with Jenny Cameron and Stephen Healy. And this book, Take Back the Economy, a guide, an ethical guide for transforming our communities, is a book that tries to invite people to inventory the different kinds of forms of labor and transactions and enterprise, property and finance that they're involved in, and take back those forms and practices of economic activity that are built around a more ethical engagement with each other and with the world. And I'm just putting up there the translations of the book, which have continued to come out in various contexts where the book has been taken up and has been used by community activists in particular. Most recently, the Mandarin versions come out. But in this book, we use lots of different kinds of ways of thinking about inventorying our lives, inventorying our connections with others, and our connections with the natural world, the more than human world. And in doing this, we were trying to refigure and recenter our sense of economic activity around how do we survive well, what kinds of labor do we put together to survive well, how do we encounter others at a distance and in both in our own society, but also at a distance in the world, how do we distribute surplus, how do we common property, and how do we invest in futures, and which of these many activities can be drawn into this kind of project. So part of our argument is that making other worlds possible relies on seeing what's already here. Other worlds are already here to some extent, but we need to help strengthen them and build on them. And so what I want to do now is turn to my second example of a more, I guess, more detailed accounting exercise, which was conducted just recently, where a group of us tried to account for the value of urban commons in Paris. And this paper I'll be talking about has just recently come out as open access in a special edition of Environment, Policy and Governance. special issue on transformative geographies of community initiatives. So the paper was written with two architects, Donna Petrescu and Konstantin Petcu, who are the architect planners who established the urban commons I'll be talking about, Maliha Safri, who is an economist in the US, and myself. And this exercise was really about examining this experiment that took place in Colombes and the outer suburbs of Paris, and in the mid 2016, 2017, where through an engagement with the local community and the municipality of Colombes, a project was established on commandeered or commoned land, two unused pieces of land in this area. So one of them was used to build an agro-cité, where there would be an urban farm and urban allotments, and the other land sequestered from half of a road that was a dead end to build a recycling laboratory to be used by the local community. And this, these two sites were part of a bigger vision of a kind of ecological reframing of living in the city, where there would be hubs for growing food, hubs for recycling material waste, ecological education, cultural exchange, build commons and negotiate what commons might look like today within a time frame of years. So this project was based on an EU grant where the time frame was designed to be over at least a decade. Unfortunately, after 4 years of operation and quite successful, there was a major political change in the municipality of Colombes, and the municipality decided to close the experiment down and cover over the agro-city with a car park. And to put it in the kind of business as usual language that was used, this was so that the asset value of the land could be realized. So what was interesting, though, was that before the closure took place, a whole lot of things, activities and transactions were measured and estimated. And a rich database was produced from which we could calculate what we called a community economy return on investment. And this was a tool that we'd introduced in Take Back the Economy, building on the social return, but trying to extend it to think about the community economies that we are interested in producing. And so there was data there to start to actually calculate what kind of returns could we see on the multiple kinds of investments that had taken place to build the Rurban project. So against the very initial investment of 1.2 million euros that came from public funds, both from the EU and from the municipality and other grant sources, we used the data collected in situ, realistic estimations, and also evidence-based indicators to see what this investment had unleashed in terms of what we might call community economy returns. So we calculated what were the direct financial revenues that were generated by the urban farming and the markets that were used where people transacted different goods and services. We also estimated the value of unpaid volunteer labour that was expended at the Rurban project. We estimated the value of increased individual capacity that was generated by the Rurban, the kind of skills and capacities that people learnt and acquired, and also the costs that were saved by Rurban to urban households through provision of food and repair, to Rurban itself and to the state. And this is all documented in the paper that I cited. And we found that the value of all these returns amounted to some 3.4 million euros. So here we know that there were multiple forms of value created by Rurban, and many more of them than could be translated into monetary amounts. But in this case, we tried to translate as many as we could into monetary amounts to make this point. So as I said, even staying with monetary amounts, we showed that the contribution of benefits derived from unpaid shared and care activities was huge, some 10 times more than the visible direct financial returns, which amounted to only about 300,000 euros. So this we saw as the return that commoning was making to this project, and which is usually invisible. So our exercise in quantification admittedly drew on the master's tools. We were using price to attempt to put value to both commodified and non-commodified values, putting them both in the same kind of calculating frame. So when we did the kind of calculation, we could see that the community economy return on investment was something like 180%, and this was only for 1 year. So had the project lasted the full 10 years, we would have had to have done more sophisticated calculations to look at what this return would have been, but I think it would have been greater. So to use the language that Michelle Bowens has used, we showed that value could be co-opted from one system, the old system, where the $1.2 million, euros were coming, and invested in commons that were capable of creating commoning value. And interestingly, I think we were able to see that for the residents involved in this project, some 600 people, there was an attempt to start to move towards being able to live within a one world ecological footprint. So this kind of exercise was important, I think, or is important when we start to think about making demands on the state for the land, or for the reuse of abandoned built infrastructure, or for resistance to property speculation, or the concreting over this kind of land as a car park to realize the asset value. So even though the Colombe exercise was closed down, the Urban project has sprung up in many different parts of Paris in a number of different locations, and here are just some of the pictures of the most recent example in another suburb, Bagneux, not that far from Colombe. So that was my second example, I guess, a very different one to the first one. And one, just in conclusion, I'd like to kind of just reflect on what I learned from these two different accounting exercises. I think from the first one, as I've already said, this Marxian value accounting exercise, I really learnt as I became more interested in a kind of post-structuralist approach to thinking about identity and theory. I could see that accounting is very much a performative intervention. It's there's a lot of theoretical infrastructure that one has to marshal if you want to maintain kind of purity, which I think we were invested in those early days. But what I learned from the calculating the value of the urban commons is that perhaps purity could be put aside if we really want to make other worlds possible, and we need to get into a whole variety of ways of putting numbers to different kinds of values in order to make the political points that we'd like to make around questions of transition and transformation. And I'd just like to end then with a paraphrase of the Latourian quote that I had earlier. I think that accounting has an important role to play in revealing ethical abilities in actors who didn't know before that they had them, and making sure that some of these new competencies are sunk into common sense through a new set of practical tools. And I hope that some of the tools that we've used in Take Back the Economy, but particularly the community economy return on investment, is something that is creating or could create a different sense of common sense around the need to survive well together, to encounter others differently, to distribute surplus in different ways, and common what we need to survive on, and invest in futures in very different ways than we're doing at the moment. I think, as Albrecht mentioned, today is a very important time to be rethinking our role as social scientists, our role as accounters, the ways in which we create social order from the mess of the world, how we reassemble the social, because it's very important at the moment for thinking forward and giving some hope, I think, to the next generation. And I think this conference is a great venue, a great space for the kinds of rethinking and imagining and developing of new kinds of tools for doing just that. So thank you for your attention, and I look forward to hearing any comments.